Lovely to see so many of you with us here today. I'm Clothilde, the Director of the Rory Peck Trust. This is a webinar on trauma and resilience, how to protect yourself and others. I'm really pleased to see so many of you here with us today. Our expert panel are going to explore how journalists can build resilience while covering difficult stories and subjects. We will discuss what is trauma-aware journalism, how you can be mindful of your contributors, but also deal with your own exposure to trauma when reporting on vulnerable individuals or communities. We're going to talk about how freelance journalists can cope with the pressures of reporting on traumatic events. And I'm delighted that we have Angelina Fusco, the chair of Dart Center Europe, and Ismail Enashe, an investigative journalist who's won various awards for his coverage of migration, which is often linked to moral injury and vicarious trauma. Both are fantastic authorities on trauma and journalism. Both will share some really interesting insights with you today. So one thing I just wanted to explain to all of you before I hand over to Angelina is that this webinar is organized within the context of the launch of the Rory Peck Trust Resilience Programme. This is something that is close to our heart. We have seen an increase in requests to our assistance funds for support to cover trauma therapies. So we know that there's an increasing rate of trauma within the journalism community, perhaps particularly so within the freelance journalism community. And so we've wanted to address this need for a while. It's proven incredibly hard to fund, but luckily, with the support of the Facebook Journalism Project, we've been able to launch our resilience program. The resilience program has two main outputs. One is to make the Dart Center's wonderful resilience and trauma workshops available free of charge to journalists all over the world. And the other is to create a trauma therapy fund that freelance journalists can apply to if they are in need of treatment and can't afford it. Our goal, of course, with all of our programs is to ensure that you can sustain your vocation and return to your important work as journalists. And so there are two parts to the resilience program. One is preventative, giving you the training to try and build your resilience so you can be prepared. And the other is to enable you to afford the treatment that you need when you do. This webinar is being recorded so that the content can be accessed after the event. Please feel free to pass the link on with anyone that you think might benefit from it. It's going to be a permanent resource on our website. At the end of the webinar, we will be open to questions. My colleague Leanne Dimiturko, which is on this call, will field those questions. She will keep a keen eye on the chat field. If you have any questions that you'd like to pose that may come up throughout the conversation, please do type them into the chat, and Leanne will ensure that as many of them as possible get addressed at the end of the panel discussion. Okay, what I would first like to do is hand over to Angelina Fusco, who is the chair of Dart Center Europe. She is working very closely with us to deliver a series of workshops in various languages through the Rory Peck Trust Resilience Programme. And she will give you a little bit of an overview about her own experience of trauma and journalism, how she came to this area of work, and what the Dart Center is known for and what the workshops tend to address. Angelina, can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to see so many people attending. We're delighted to be working with the Rory Peck Trust, funded by that Facebook initiative, news initiative. So I suppose I should just explain, because you're all busy people and you don't have time to kind of keep researching on the web, but Dart Center, really Dart Center in Journalism and Trauma, it's a resource center and a global network of journalists, of educators, health practitioners, just to explore and the media coverage of trauma. And it began by exploring the kind of intersection between news reporting and violence. When I worked in journalism, we used to talk about, if it bleeds, it leads. So, we're covering violence all the time. And I'm not necessarily talking just about conflict. though my background is in the conflict in Northern Ireland and covering it, but it can also be a local fire, a natural disaster, anything like that that has tragedy involved with it. So it has encouraged kind of lots of research on the impact of reporting on trauma, and supports and encourages really mental health among journalists, impacts of threat or harassment and related topics. In my own experience, I can only say that, I believe if we're trauma and resilient aware, it results in better journalism. It helps us be more accurate, improve storytelling, and allows us to do our jobs much more effectively and actually for a longer time because we're healthy, both mentally and physically. So a little bit of background about me. I worked in journalism in Northern Ireland, covering the Northern Ireland conflict for over 30 years. Started off young, dark-haired. Now you can see that it had an impact on me. As a child, I was forced to flee from my home. My cousin was shot dead in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And it was a very difficult time. You were reporting on your own conflict in your own hometown, in your own community. We had about over 3,500 people killed, which compared to conflicts nowadays seems a very small number, but this is a very small place. So everybody was affected, and including journalists. They came from different sections of the community and we had to work together. So I was very fortunate in some ways, I suppose for a couple of reasons. I worked in papers originally, and then I joined the BBC. So, that's a good organization to work for. It has ethics and it has values. I then moved into production from street reporting. So I suppose I wasn't seeing it firsthand, but was making decisions, ethical decisions on what we would show audiences and viewers. And the third thing I had was great family and friends in terms of social support as well. Up to the mid 2000s, as I said, we had explosions and death. We were also doing investigations into child abuse, for example. The words journalism and trauma, they were never spoken about. Journalists just drank and they smoked and they had dark humor. Terrible dark humor, actually. When I think back on it, wouldn't be allowed today. But there was a lot of drinking. And that's how people just went to a pub or a club and they didn't want to go home and tell their relatives about what they'd seen and heard and the difficulties. And all of a sudden, there was just something in the early 2000s that happened in the BBC, asked me to go on a little pilot, and the words journalism and trauma were put together for the first time. One of my colleagues, the late Seamus Kelters, I kind of forced to go to Columbia when they were doing their first fellowship. He was very skeptical. He was interested in the people we were interviewing. It was nothing to do with us. It was nothing to do with, we weren't traumatized in any way. And he came back from that fellowship transformed, and helped his learning transform how I looked at how we did our journalism and how my colleagues did. And it really, there's two sides of the coin. One is, we were going off running down the roads with cameras and interviewing vulnerable contributors who'd lost loved ones or seen an explosion or been injured themselves. And we didn't actually think about whether we were inflicting unnecessary distress on them and making things worse. We just ran in, got the interview, ran out again, put it on air. How did we really get an accurate account of what had happened when we didn't have time to listen to them? When we didn't think what was the impact actually on this trauma on them, physically, psychologically, socially. And then the other side was actually, what do we need to know about how to look after ourselves? Because we're working with this emotionally toxic material nonstop every day. And we had to make sure that our teams, and certainly by that stage, I was an editor, what were my team experiencing? Were they able to sleep? Were they having kind of, bad dreams? Were they nervous about doing various things? So what the Dart Centre learning did for me was, I suppose, just opened a little bit of the science. So I'm not an expert, I'm not a clinician, but what is the science of trauma? And understanding what it does to you mentally, physically, socially, in communities. Well, actually, if that's what's happening to our contributors, how can I help? So, very simply, for example, knowing about the science, one of the things that we started to look at was before, during, and after interviews. And what was our normal practice? What could we do differently that might support, be more empathetic to contributors? And we kind of drew up with our colleagues and other journalists like Ismail and other journalists who in the Dart family, what were good practices before, during, and after interviews? Before, for example, really preparing properly, being respectful, maybe asking people, did they want somebody to sit with them, giving them their name and number, explaining the process, because they don't understand the journalistic process. They have maybe 10 journalists standing outside their door, wanting interviews. What do we do during the interview? We're not there to make them feel better, but we are there to be respectful and empathetic. So we maybe listen better, we maybe explain the situation a bit better to them. And maybe afterwards, we go, maybe just give them a call back or a family member and say, look, we just want to double check. This is what we're saying. Possibly check it, maybe even informing them that there could be some maybe adverse comments on social media, and maybe they should avoid listening to that. I mean, there's just loads of different things. They're just a couple of things that kind of I was thinking about. But then I think, again, I was fortunate to learn from the best, because I don't know, like a lot of you, and I wanted to get the energy out when I was finished. I was going to the gym, I was running. And then someone introduced me to yoga, and I thought, no, I can't do yoga. My brain's too active to do yoga. But I did some yoga, and I learned how to breathe. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but actually one of the things we'll do in the workshop is actually, share some breathing, and that slowing down your body, learning actually to put everything away from your mind was so helpful to me. And I wish I'd learned it, 15 or 20 years earlier. So, the good news about trauma and resilience is that we as journalists are really resilient. We have a mission. We want to do this story. We want to tell people stories. We want to explain. And that is really important to remember. So people will talk about post-traumatic stress injury, but in the end, very few journalists will actually suffer that. But they will be challenged. Their resilience will be challenged over years. And it depends how long you're going to be doing it. It depends what kind of stories you're doing. So actually just learning how to look after yourself, some tips and techniques will really help. And I'm very conscious of freelancers don't have the support of their colleagues in a newsroom. So I think it's a really useful exercise to be able to just know some of these things. And if they don't work, if you don't need it now, that's okay. But you might need it a couple of years down the line, and you'll be used, it'll be very useful techniques and tips that other people will share. So they're not all my tips and techniques. They're from a wealth of fantastic journalists, photojournalists, filmmakers, all over the world, who have put their heads together and shared their learnings and their experiences. So I do hope some of you will sign up for the workshops. And there's loads of resources on the Dart Centre website that you can use in the meantime.
Thank you so much for that, Angelina. It was also really interesting for me to actually hear how you came up through journalism and ended up specialising in this field, and your journalism background reporting on the Troubles. It's really, really interesting, gives a lot of context. I want to invite Ismail to tell us a little bit about his own experiences of covering traumatic events. So he's he's actually specialized in covering refugees and the tricky stories around the Mediterranean about people emigrating and crossing the sea and doing that, really, really challenging, huge effort to come to safety. And he's had to learn how to cope with being exposed to those kind of stories and really living it day in, day out. Angelina spoke about how journalists are particularly resilient, that having a purpose in life gives you resilience, but also that over time that can be challenging. It can be challenging to be exposed repeatedly over time. Ismail, why don't you tell us a little bit about your own experiences, how you came to choose to do the Ockberg Fellowship, which is the fellowship that specializes in trauma-aware journalism at Dart, and maybe a little bit about how that informed your strategies for maintaining your own resilience, which you've obviously succeeded in doing because you've then gone on to win various prizes for your amazing journalism.
Thank you so much. It's a very kind introduction. Greetings to you all from Palermo in Sicily. Thank you, Angelina. So to begin, I guess I've been a journalist now just almost a decade. And I began my career like Angelina, not quite to those heights, but I also began at the BBC as a researcher a long time ago. And then I sort of found my way to kind of doing reporting, which was initially kind of long form. And then eventually I have come to really focus on in-depth investigative reporting around migration, particularly at the moment around the experiences of child refugees and migrants. I'm part of a cross-border journalism project called Lost in Europe, which investigates the disappearances of child migrants, includes myself and 23 other journalists in 10 European countries. Some of those journalists, actually, 2 of them are former Ockberg Fellows. I'll come to that in a minute, by the Ockberg Fellowship and how I got there. But one of them is Sana Tellingen. I just want to give a shout out to Dutch journalist. And the other is Rosa Meneses, who is a Spanish journalist at El Mundo. So I have been very interested in these stories, like Angelina, I guess, both from a personal viewpoint, but also from the viewpoint of being a journalist covering these issues. And I guess, I'm here currently in Palermo, where I'm based from at the moment. And I, like many journalists across Europe, came to kind of try and cover those stories in that period of sort of 2015 and 16, during the so-called migrant crisis. I stuck around. And I was really frustrated with some of the reporting that was being done in terms of telling stories about people who had escaped various situations in their home countries, whether it's conflict, economic situation, violence, and in this case, who were coming via the Mediterranean to Europe. And I was really frustrated that the media coverage really dehumanized people. I saw news coverage in which people who were crossing from sub-Saharan Africa were described as marauding Africans. There were these very cliche-heavy kind of reporting, news reports, radio reports, where people would evoke idea of kind of nature sort of cliches and metaphors to kind of give the sense that Europe somehow was being flooded or overwhelmed from people from over there. Who came for no apparent reason, and there was no context given. So I was frustrated by that coverage, and slowly I began to think, surely there's a different way to do it. And I think what is really interesting as a reporter, particularly for colleagues who are freelancers who, as Angelina mentioned, tend to work in our own silos quite often. We have colleagues on the ground, photographers, other fellow journalists, whether you're, mixed media, audio or print, it's sort of the same really, but often you're on your own, right? And you're dealing with somebody who is an editor or a commissioner back home or in a different country. So it can be quite a challenge as a freelancer to find this kind of community. But I was really frustrated by what I was seeing in the news around migration in Europe and also in Africa, in East Africa particularly, which is another place that I spend time in and report from. And at that time, around 2015-16, I was covering these issues in my journalism, and I was frustrated by the coverage, and I wanted to find a different way to report ethically, in a way that did not dehumanize the people that I was reporting about, that did not put me at risk as well. And I didn't know about Dart, but I think stumbled a lot. I stumbled on the Dart Center through a friend of mine who invited me along to a meeting, and that's how kind of my Dart collaboration began. And I think what I want to say is that a lot of this, how do we do trauma-informed reporting? How do we do things that are ethical? I think it's a question, an issue we all struggle with, and I don't think anybody can claim to have the right answer. But I think in the Dart Center, I found a space that there were other like-minded journalists that were trying to do stories, whatever issue or beat they were covering, they were trying to do it in a trauma-informed, sensitive, ethical way. And for me, my beat and my passion has been migration reporting and particular aspects of that. And when I came to the Dart Center, I met other colleagues who were wrestling with these similar concerns about media coverage, about our responsibility as reporters with people we're reporting about, also dealing with issues of self-care and how we ourselves protect ourselves in those environments. And I think when I came to Dart, I began to find this kind of language. And again, it's important to, as Angelina was saying, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert on trauma per se, but I think what I've learned through the experiences is that a lot of us already, and I imagine many of us on this call, were wrestling with particular questions and issues, wherever country you are, whatever particular beat you're covering, and thinking, I've got these sort of gut kind of instincts, right? Something is wrong. An editor's asked you to do something, or somebody has, you know, especially in my case as a writer, I do the text and then someone chooses an image to go along with the text, or an editor sat in London or New York will choose the headline, there'll be subhead, the whole piece will be packaged in a certain ways. And I've got experiences where things went awry and I was really unhappy, and I felt some of the images that went along with the pieces I published was somewhat dehumanizing and so on. So we've all wrestled with these kinds of questions. And I think when I found Dart, I was able to find that space. And eventually I managed to get the Dart Center's Ockberg Fellowship, which is named after Frank Ockberg, who's a pioneer in trauma science, and really was instrumental in helping the Dart Center come to existence. And the Dart Center runs the Ockberg Fellowship in its honor. It's not been happening, I think, for the last year or so because of the pandemic, but it's been going for quite a long time. And every year they select 10 to 12 or so journalists across the world covering this, you know, traumatic issues and violence and conflict and so on. So I would really encourage you to all apply and really, you know, take part in this. And the other quick thing I wanted to say, because we'll have more of a conversation, is that, you know, none of us, well, in my experience, you know, really were taught about how to report when it comes to traumatized individuals or people who are in traumatic environments. And I think it's really important to be mindful that interviewing people who are vulnerable is harder than interviewing the powerful. And it does require more skill, awareness, and engagement. And I think we also have to be mindful of the industry that we're in, particularly many colleagues might know on this call that if you're in countries in the global south, in developing context, countries with conflict, you know, there are issues, historic and contemporary, about the ways in which those places, those conflicts have been reported. And I think often the trouble is that the media as it is doesn't really reflect, you know, us. I can talk particularly in the context of Britain, having grown up in London. The media space doesn't reflect, you know, the society as it is in London. So we shouldn't be surprised that we tend to get these tropes and stereotypes and stigmas and racism, frankly, in many cases. So I'm going to probably pick up a lot of these points, but I just wanted to get that point across that, you know, we need to learn different ways and to report ethically in a sound fashion. I think that is a really good space to begin. We have to be mindful of the people we're reporting about, but also we have to be mindful of you know, looking after ourselves, because I think it's really important to remember that, you know, we owe it to ourselves and to our contributors to do self-care. And we'll come on to that. I probably said too much at the beginning, but hopefully that's enough for now. And it's lovely to be with you all.
Thank you so much, Ismail, for such a frank introduction to all the thoughts that motivated you towards, you know, doing your Ockberg Fellowship, and also sharing some of the concerns, I guess they were, about how you saw journalism about migration being covered and how you thought it could be done better, and wanting to educate yourself and others about that. What you touched on some of the language that is used in reporting of migration, etc. I want to ask Angelina to chip in here. How do you think the way we use language matters within the context of reporting of traumatic events?
I think our language is really important. We kind of, I think Ismail's right. You know, and we're taught to interview the powerful, you know, not the vulnerable. And quite often we go into cliches. You know, one of the, after I did the Ockberg Fellowship and my own learning from DART, I just banned in my team the use of the word closure when it came to, you know, after a traumatic event or people have been killed. People say, oh, you know, and they're looking for closure. And, you know, I don't know about you, but, you know, I've lost loved ones. There's never closure. There's always an anniversary and Christmas and birthdays. So, you know, things like that are not good. And we just need to think about it and not just kind of use the trite language that other people have used. Another example, which a clinician friend of mine, she and I did a little workshop together on do no harm journalism in Northern Ireland. And she shared a great example, I found. And it was after a community had been through a really bad tragedy. And she kind of became two different reporters. And one reporter would say in their piece to camera at the end, you know, this community's been through a tragedy, everyone is traumatized, you know, don't know how it's all, people are going to pick up the pieces. The alternate is, you know, this community's been through a tragedy. Many people have, you know, there has been trauma, they've experienced trauma. They're not traumatized, but they're experienced trauma. But what I've noticed when I've been here are people supporting each other, you know, families helping each other. The students are in and they're, you know, making soup and sandwiches. And I actually saw that happening, that second part, when I was in Christchurch in New Zealand, when the Christchurch earthquake. And they did really focus on really good supportive networks that were going on and systems that were going on. But if you go back to that community 4 or 5 years later, almost there's a framework has been set that they're traumatized and they'll never get over it. Or, you know, they're working together and something will happen. You don't want to give false hope. People, some of them may have been traumatized, but actually it's just, they have been through a traumatic experience. Because we don't, if I have been through something, I haven't had a diagnosis of that I've been traumatized. So we should just be careful of some of those words that it's just, we're used to hearing it, and therefore it works through our journalism as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And in fact, journalists do have a huge power in choosing the words that they use, because they frame the stories of the audience and how the audience sees and understands the world. Ismail, you also mentioned in our previous conversations that there are myths about trauma and what you can do when you're at that crisis point. Do you want to touch on those?
Yes, I think it's what Angelina was saying, that, you know, for example, the last, you know, year and a half, we've had this global pandemic, and often people talk about it in the sense that everyone is traumatized because of this global pandemic, but actually very few people have been traumatized because of what's been happening. People have been distressed, no doubt. People have lost their jobs and livelihoods. Things have been pretty tough. And I think we have to be careful about ascribing somebody has been traumatized or not. Remember, we journalists, we're not clinicians. It's not our job to diagnose people. And I think also the myth that I was talking about last time in relation to trauma is that this victim lens, which I find really problematic, because we're also talking in this conversation about resilience. And I think when we frame trauma, and this is in the case of traumatized individuals, whether they're, in the case that I've reported on, whether it's in Somalia with people there, or in Kenya, or in Palermo where I am with Nigerian women and girls that are trafficked for sexual slavery, for example, much of the media coverage about some of these kind of issues and individuals and groups and communities can really be kind of, in a sense, the experiences can be filtered in the media through this lens of victimhood, which takes away agency and takes away their resilience. So I think in part, that means as journalists, we can tell different stories in which we don't shy away from the difficult things that have happened to people, but we think about points and junctures in their stories at which they have overcome. Because often when you interview somebody who's been through a particularly difficult experience, I mentioned, for example, because I'm in Palermo at the moment, I'll stay with the example of trafficking, and particularly the trafficking of Nigerian women, is that when I've interviewed women in this situation, particularly those who managed to escape their traffickers and have taken the brave stance to denounce them and have got involved in activism to try and free other women like themselves, they always say, look, don't talk about, only my pain, and don't reduce me to that experience. Actually, is what I did after. So I think we need a balance in the reporting, that we can't always frame people through the victim lens. And I think there's also another element of that, which is that it often takes on a racial dimension. And I think it's the ways in which, for example, when you're reporting in various parts in the global south, I can speak primarily from East Africa, that I find much of the media coverage can tend to focus on those aspects. And also reporters, by the way, from the West who are in those countries will tend to get away with a lot more. So I think that's why it's also really important to both acknowledge in terms of the coverage of those individuals, but also we as journalists, as reporters, whether we're freelance or not, as newspapers, as news media, there's a long, problematic, deeply toxic history here of the ways in which, places such as, the continent of Africa, and particularly the east of Africa, where I can speak of from my experience of reporting there and my own personal connections, is that it's been reframed in that way. And that's why language matters. And the other final thing I'd also mention, we discussed this last time, is that trauma is not also destiny. Just because, somebody has had a really traumatic experience doesn't mean that everything is over for them. Actually, you can get post-traumatic growth. Some of the most interesting people I've ever met, actually in my own life, in my own family too, are people who've been through some of the most difficult things in their lives. And it's how they got out, and the story and the wisdom and the perspective that they've gained. So I think it's balancing the kind of stories we tell and the kind of framing we engage with. And us as journalists asking ourselves, how do we do that? And actually there's a lot, I've already gone on for too long, but there's a lot out there already. There's a Solution Journalism Network, obviously the work of the DART. There's a lot of people that are trying to do journalism in a different way, which doesn't mean you shy away from the real things that happen to people, but that we tell in a different way, in which we place agency and resilience alongside traumatic events and experiences.
Yeah, it sounds like you're coming back to the point that Angelina made at the beginning about ensuring that you're really prepared, that you bring a huge amount of respect to your reporting and your interviewing, and that you share the process, you explain the process so that your interviewee or your contributor is as empowered as you are as the reporter, and it's a shared endeavor that's created through respect. You also mentioned, again, the fact that if somebody has experienced a trauma, they're not necessarily over. They will come through it and recover, and they must not be reduced to victims. We've had actually quite a lot of questions in the chat about the difference between being traumatized and experiencing a trauma. And this is actually quite more complicated language than people realize. And I think, Angelina, you've touched on the fact that one of the things that the workshops goes into is actually understanding what is trauma, what does it actually do to your body, what is the difference. But do you want to give a very brief overview, Angelina, of the difference between those two concepts, because they are coming up in the chat from people listening today?
Yes, I suppose people will have heard post-traumatic stress disorder, and that sounds like something that you can't recover from. The view from many clinicians and therapists is to talk about post-traumatic stress injury. So, you know, if you break an arm, you go to the doctor, you get it fixed, and there's a kind of sizable number of clinicians who will talk about that maybe there's an injury and how you recover from that. But you know, there are scientific there's a kind of couple of points about when someone is traumatized and when they're clinically diagnosed as that. And it could be that they have, you know, they have witnessed themselves, or they may have secondary trauma through watching material, vicarious trauma, which they have watched material. But it also, it could be a one-off. It could be a long tail of kind of a number of different traumas that have happened over time. But it's, you know, are they maybe not sleeping? Are they being triggered on a regular occasion? Let me give you an example. Someone who was on an Ockberg fellowship that I was involved in had a really bad experience when they were, I think it was Iraq. They were embedded with troops. They had gone out, had all prepared, had done their health and safety, etc., etc. But while out on a patrol, they actually collapsed, and it was to do with heat. The issue was heat. Okay, so it wasn't that they'd watched anything or anything like that, but you know, technically that person died and was brought back to life, and did have post-traumatic stress, but did not understand, you know, that that's what it was until they realized that they weren't really getting very well, and they kept being triggered by two different particular things. One was when the sun was in a particular position, and the second one, which, you know, you might find strange, but actually it was the sound of Velcro. And when they did, you know, when they went and sought help eventually, they realized that actually the Velcro was the sound that they heard as the medics were dealing with them. So it's not just about your sight, it's about the hearing, it's about the taste of something, it's about the smell of something that can trigger people back. So I can look back on, you know, seeing, you know, terrible sights here, but I know they're in the past. If you're going through post-traumatic stress, for example, you might be where you're triggered and you're back at that moment when it happened and you have no control. And the other thing I think is important is that, you know, it's when we talk, and Ismail talked about the science, you know, it's very simple. If I can understand it, anybody can understand it. But, you know, you have a little gland at the back of your head called the amygdala, and it is your survival mechanism. If suddenly you smelt smoke or fire or whatever, your body would start to nearly move before you do. And it goes right back to when we were in caves. So it's a saber-toothed tiger. So you'll either fight it, you'll run from it, you flee from it, or you freeze. And they are physical things that you cannot control. It will just happen. And if you've been traumatized, there's another gland that's connected to it, and it actually keeps the memory of the trauma. So it's very hard to break out of that cycle. So I would be triggered and would be smelling that smell all the time. If I went somewhere and suddenly smelled smoke, somebody could be barbecuing, I could be really affected by that. So what the science in the workshops will teach you is this is what happens. How do you deal with it? And how do you recognize it in the people that you're interviewing? So the person you may be interviewing who's been through a really bad tragedy or traumatic could be, for example, really angry, wants to fight you. might be really closed down, has gone into a freeze where they don't remember. And actually knowing and recognizing some of those behaviors helps you draw out slowly and respectfully, you know, what they have experienced without re-traumatizing them, but making them feel in control. And sometimes that's just by asking, do they want to have somebody with them when they're interviewing, giving them a card explaining your name and your number, being respectful of them, and not and just being aware, because you will get a better interview out of those people if you can understand what they or recognize the behaviors of where they might be going. And again, when it comes to us as individual reporters, then are you seeing any of those things? Are you seeing yourself irritable all the time? You know, one of my colleagues showed this. It's a brilliant thing. It's so simple. It's a thermometer, which I ask people, you know, I show them where they can get it online. And it's a picture of a thermometer, and it starts every day. So where are you in the thermometer? So if you're down nice and cool and calm, that's great. But you know, you're under pressure, you've had a hard day, your partner's having a row with you, your mum says you never call her, you might be up about 7 or 8. But if you're at 9 and 10 every day, that's not a healthy place to be, because if something else comes in on top of that, another pressure, another challenge, you know, it can make you burn out, it can make you be very ill. So that's why something simple like grounding or breathing properly, just taking time, walking in nature, being with friends who don't talk about journalism all the time, can be very useful and very helpful in building resilience. Because remember, resilience is like, I call it kind of bounce back ability. It's like a tree, great strong roots, but it you know, it waves in the wind, but it's flexible. And that's, I think, what we want to grow in our resilience as journalists.
Thank you very much for that, Angelina. That's a really, really useful overview. And you also touched, you hinted at the idea of the fact that this awareness will not only help you look after your own well-being, but will also make you a better journalist. I really want to come back to that a little bit later. But in the meantime, I want to ask Ismail, so this webinar is dedicated to freelance journalists. The whole of the Rory Peck Trust exists to support freelance journalists. And the reason for that is because we know that they are the most vulnerable. They don't have the huge institutional backing that staff journalists get. And so most of what we do is to try and provide for freelance journalists what staff journalists can enjoy from their own institutions. Can you, Ismail, do you want to touch a little bit on some of what you know of colleagues or your own experience as a freelancer that may contribute to creating more vulnerability in this space for journalists who are freelancers?
Yes, thank you. It's a really big issue, and I think the work of the Rory Peck Trust is so important in this space, both in advocating for freelancers and giving resources in a space for the freelance journalist community. I think one of the experience that I've had, that many colleagues have had, whether I'm in Europe or in Africa or in the Middle East, and you know, be part of this global network of colleagues, kind of covering these sorts of stories, which are often, you know, in conflict zones, human rights, migration, etc., is the issue of just being a freelancer, full stop, in the news industry. Everything from pay to insurance to your personal safety, to being put at risk by editors and newspapers, to effectively, you know, some cases just being treated with disregard. And then there's also the layers of this, of course. Then there's, you know, gender, you know, LGBTQI, trans community, people of color, you know, who are journalists, face extra burdens. Refugee journalists face extra burdens. Journalists working in conflict zones in Afghanistan, in Somalia, my country of birth. In Somalia, the situation is particularly awful for journalists, and the everyday experiences of journalists there is grim. And then we have a situation where there is, you know, freelancers, in this case, from say the West, perhaps have more resources than freelancers in Somalia, say, but still freelancers, even if they're from the UK or France or wherever, face burdens in those places. I mean, the first thing is, how do you fund your journalism, which is a perennial issue, which I think maybe is saved for another day. Then how do you stay safe and sane? How do you build a network? And that's where peer-to-peer support comes handy. And I think it's really helpful for you to think about who in your network, whether it's, and it should be a colleague probably, I think, if you're a freelancer, because editor relationship can be a bit more complicated, especially because they don't tend to, I'm generalizing here, be in the place that you're reporting from. So they don't really maybe have firsthand experience of what you're going through. So find somebody that you trust and like, and that knows your work, that is a journalist that covers similar issues, and maybe just have a brief with them before you go somewhere, and a debrief. Think about this as kind of doing trauma risk assessment for yourself before and after you report. And then specifically, I see questions in the chat. There are lots of specific examples of the skills needed, how to do it, tip sheets, all of that will be shared. But what I really wanted to get across is that being a freelance journalist in this industry can itself be a really difficult experience. I mean, I'm sure we all have our stories of things that have happened to us. And one of the things is obviously making a living and trying to do this properly. And also the fact that, the news industry is shifting and in decline, pay is going down, standards are going down. Very few editors seem to be very engaged with what's happening on the ground. I think at the beginning of my career, when I was taking perhaps more risk, going to places, I don't think editors would ever ask, how did you get that story? What happened when you went there? And it's been rare that I've actually been asked that. And I think that's a real problem. And I don't think, newspapers, news media are very good at looking after freelancers. And I worry for particularly young freelancers, because I think there have been some instances where people are pressured to take more risks than they should to get a story. And of course, the whole pandemic has been really devastating for freelance journalists all across the world, particularly in the developing countries. And I think there needs to be more pressure for newspapers and the news media to do more. For example, the Rory Peck Trust, gives grants to people, to freelance journalists to do their HEFAT training. I did that through getting a grant from the Rory Peck years back. And I think, one thing newspapers could do is invest in that, or invest in the program that DART is doing, which Angelina has already mentioned. But really, I think that's an aspect of the industry that as a freelancer, we don't often those who are not freelance journalists know the unique pressures that we face. And actually, because the way the industry has changed, as I mentioned, and especially I think after COVID probably, that a lot of newspapers are pulling out their correspondence in these places. So they're going to have to rely on freelancers to get into tough places and locations and countries. And therefore, there'll be people taking more risk. And, there are probably very few, but I know of many stories of people taking very stupid, dangerous risks just to get a story. And I think that shouldn't happen, but it does happen. My fear is that will continue happening until this issue of the business of being a freelance journalist, getting respect, dignity in work, being protected and be treated, with respect, and until that gets much more prominence, I think it will continue happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Ismail. You are absolutely right. There is a correlation between income and safety, and we know that from a Frontline Freelance Register survey of their journalist members that was done in 2019, which showed a very clear correlation between pay and safety. Obviously, if your income is limited, it's harder for you to even consider insurance, let alone invest in any proper kit that you might need, or, as Ismail mentioned, trying to arrange some what he called trauma risk assessment, and what we call psychological risk awareness. Just being aware of not only your physical risk, but also your psychological safety, your online safety, and the legal risk awareness that might come with any given story. I mean, we've seen at the Rory Peck Trust that our safety clinics, which try and match try to match security experts with freelance journalists preparing for assignments, and try and get them the free consultations that provide the kind of safety advice that institutions would if you were staff. We've seen 4 areas of safety come out of those, and they are physical, psychological, digital, and legal. And those all intersect, and there's an awful lot to juggle as a freelance journalist. And so you're right, just the business of freelancing, which is something that we are very aware of, needs support and needs more training on, is another area of our webinars that we tend to cover. So we've got a few minutes left. We've got about 10 minutes, just under 10 minutes left. I've tried to pick up some of the questions that have come through the chat as they've come through, and I've addressed a few of them with Ismail and Angelina. If you have any questions remaining, please do type them into the chat now, and we'll make an effort to address them all. In the meantime, Angelina or Ismail, we mentioned how trauma-aware journalism is actually not only in the interests of the well-being of your contributors and in your own well-being, but it's actually in the interests of the quality of your journalism. Do you want to expand a little bit on that, either of you?
Yeah, I think it does come back, as Ismail said, to kind of being ethical, having values. I think it's to do with the language. It's to do with the depth of the story, I suppose, as well. That if you're aware of some, I mean, I just know that journalists that I've worked with, reporters who worked for me, after we talked about this, after we kind of explored it, and as Ismail said, just having the space to talk about this, nobody ever talked about it before. What does it mean, and does it mean we don't do interview? But actually, one of the things, one of the decisions that I made with Seamus Kelters, who was my producer and an Ockberg fellow as well, was one time in Northern Ireland, after we had gone through this and learned about DART and learned about trauma-informed journalism, we were offered a pooled interview with a woman whose husband was a police officer and had been killed. And it was quite rare to do pooled interviews, but the other organization did the pooled interview. And in the pooled interview, the interviewer on a number of occasions said to this contributor, and what happened when the police came to the door. So to the very moment when she now is told that her husband is dead. And she would break down. And she did this 4 times. And she was asked the same question 4 times. And usually we would run this out, because I had was very passionate about allowing more time in our program for victims and survivors and families. And we made a call not to run it. We made a call to chop it and just run the bits that we wanted, because not only was it not good for the individual interviewee to be seen in such a distressed state. Actually, the audience doesn't want to see it. The audience knows that the person is distressed, and it makes them uncomfortable as well. So, yes, it's difficult, and some people, from a different part of the team, a different part of the organization, said, why didn't you run it out? And I said, because when we heard the questions, they actually didn't sit with the values that we wanted. And if you, I do media training sometimes with victims and survivors, and somebody said to me recently that they had done one interview. They had said no for years, and then they did this one interview, and a person said to them, so their brother had been killed outside their front door, blown up in a car bomb. And the reporter said to them, did it help in any way that he died instantly? At which point I went onto the table, and I thought, what was the reporter trying to do at that point? Were they trying to make themselves feel a bit better? Were they trying to make it better for the and that's not good. And that's the legacy that we leave with contributors. So therefore, journalists don't get a good name. And I think, again, just using the right words, actually thinking about the words we use. We've got careless, we're busy, we're 24-hour news cycle, we're digitally on all the time. But just thinking sometimes about, actually, you know, were they traumatized or were they affected by trauma? There is a difference. One is a clinical diagnosis and one isn't.
Very good point. And also people, you know, we forget that the audience is incredibly sophisticated. They know when they're being manipulated by, you know, what overly dramatic scenes for the sake of ratings, you know, and it just doesn't work. I think there does need to be a greater awareness of the reader, the quality of the information, what you're trying to get at with your journalism, you know, a more informed society, better choices made at decision level, etc.
I think just a very small point, but I think, you know, what happens to the audience is they decide to click or glaze. They're not engaged with it. You know, and we've seen that with Ismail's, the story of migrants, of people, refugees, where people just switch off. I don't want to see that anymore. I've had enough of it. I can't deal with that pain because I've had, you know, COVID in my family or whatever it might be. So we need to find different ways and more innovative ways of telling those stories that engage people. Tell us about the person. Tell me they were a baker. Tell me what they did. You know, they're more than a refugee. They're more than that.
Absolutely. So we're going to wrap up now with a few words about what is included in the resilience and trauma workshops that you can access through the new Rory Peck Trust Resilience Programme. The few questions that have come up have been very much about what are the skills that people should use when they are interviewing people, and what is the considerations that should be made, particularly for journalists from developing countries like Pakistan or India, where they may not be an established trauma-aware education program. But I will encourage you all to look at the links that we will share to each and every one of you after this webinar that will refer you to some fantastic resources on the DART website, and also to apply, if you are interested in this area, to the resilience and the trauma and resilience workshops which we're running. So just to give you a very brief overview, the workshops that we're running, which are fully funded by our partners, the Facebook Journalism Project, would be, they cover an introduction to trauma. So you can be more aware, what is it and what does it do to us? Also, how trauma and other stressors might impact your storytelling or need to be considered in how you tell a story. The workshops do include tips and best practice for interviewing vulnerable contributors, as well as how to build your own resilience and your own practical self-care techniques to lower stress. All four of these elements will improve the quality of your journalism. So it's not just about protecting others and yourself, it is also about improving the quality of your journalism through that. Now, the first workshops we're running are actually taking place next week, and they are being held in English, and they are now fully booked. But the next set of workshops are taking place next month in November, and we're running a Russian language workshop. And then after that, next year in January, we will do a Spanish language workshop. And then in February, we will be back with more English language workshops. So in February and March, we will have more English language workshops. All of these dates, as well as the details I've gone over about the program, are on our website, which will be included in the resources that will be shared out to all of you. I just want to thank both Angelina and Ismail. Thank you so much for your frank and open discussion about your own experiences and how you came to this area of work. It's been a real pleasure listening to you and learning from you both. I'm really looking forward to working with Angelina on the resilience program, which will be running through to August next year. Ismail, you touched on some very interesting points about working in collaboration, the support of peers, how to earn a living as a journalist. I'm sure we will invite you back to expand on some of those ideas, which are some really, really important lessons for all journalists trying to make a living out of such an important vocation. I want to thank you all, and thank you all of our attendees. It was really such a pleasure to see so many people join us this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for all your questions as well.
Bye.